everybody, welcome to the Build Young, Grow Wealthy podcast. My name is Salita Cherie, and today I want to talk to you about my 2020 end of the year review. So basically, in today's podcast, I want to let you know that there might be a few triggers, but I want to talk to you about my reactions about some events that happened this year in the year of 2020. So if you are listening to this podcast later on, know that this was my experience. So without further ado, let's get into this. So first I want to talk about the fire that happened in Australia back in January, which is very devastating because it killed billions with a B of animals because of bushfires that spread throughout Australia. And so for those of you who don't know, Australia has seasons where they have fires from September through March. There were even speculations that some of those fires were man-made, but I don't have any proof to say if it was or if it wasn't. But all I can say is my heart really dropped when I heard about all the animals that died. They were innocent. They had nothing to do with those fires. And I don't know annually how many animals die from those fires, but the way the news presented things, this was an unusual circumstance, and it even spread to the part where there are people that inhabit the land. That was how 2020 started off. As January was about to end, the worst news happened for me. Full disclosure, this might be TMI. I was sitting on the toilet and I was scrolling on my phone and I see this post from my friend on social media, and I basically got really offended because I'm like, it's very disrespectful to make rumors saying somebody died. And so I do a Google search. I don't really see anything. So I'm like, okay, he is definitely being very immature spreading rumors. I saw something from TMZ, which to me is not a reputable news source, but I kept looking at other sources and it started to pop up. And so that's when everything kind of went downhill from there. Next thing I know, I scream, and my boyfriend, he must have saw what I saw. I came out the bathroom and he just helped me because I was bawling my eyes out. Kobe, his daughter Gianna, her teammates, their parents, some coaches, as well as the pilot were all in a bad accident that day. They were in Kobe's private helicopter, which according to sources, they were told not to fly that day because it was extremely foggy. And the helicopter ended up crashing into a mountain and it killed everybody on board. Kobe has always been my favorite player. I had been following him since he was at Lower Merion, and I watched as he went into the league. I watched him his whole career. I was such a Kobe fan that back in college I had a Spanish exam, and this exam was like a make or break for my grade. But he was playing the Indiana Pacers, so I definitely had to be there. I'm not gonna study, I'm going to go see Kobe play. And it was a blizzard outside, I could barely see, but I was like, I am going to be at that game because I wasn't sure how long he was going to keep playing, but I wanted to definitely see him in person, so I took the risk. Man, that was so risky. I had no idea if I was going to make it alive, and I had no idea if I was going to pass that test, but I was willing to make that risk because Kobe, for me, he was worth it. He was the reason I played basketball. He was the reason why I wanted to go to Italy so bad, which I went to Italy now, I believe, 2 or 3 times. And besides the scandals, his performance on the floor and his talent was undisputable. And so I am definitely sad by his death, but I'm very blessed that I was a part of witnessing his legacy while he was alive. One of the next events that happened in 2020 was something called the coronavirus, also known as COVID-19, which originated in Wuhan, China. We had been hearing about it on the news, but we didn't really think it was a big deal here in America because it was way overseas. But by March, things just kind of got out of control. A lot of bad things started to happen. One of the biggest things is the stock market crashed at its all-time low at 20,000 points. Then it was declared that it was a pandemic, which meant that everything had to get shut down. People had to start wearing masks. You couldn't see your family and friends. You couldn't really go to work, so most jobs had moved online. It was just a hot mess. 2020, during that part, that was the hottest mess of 2020, in my opinion. By May, things started to look a little bit better, but then something else happened. A man by the name of George Floyd ended up being murdered on camera in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where millions of people was able to witness it. It made a lot of people angry. It caused a lot of riots and looting to go on in the city of Minneapolis, but then it started to go all around the country. We were still in a global pandemic. Things were still being shut down, but there were millions of people in the streets rioting and looting. So that became a big problem because then they were afraid that now this virus had been spread at a more faster speed because now people were all congregated closely together. The groups responsible for organizing the riots and the looting were the Black Lives Matter organization and Antifa. There were others that were murdered during this time frame, but it just got worse, it seemed like, all summer. So I feel like every other week or every few weeks somebody was being killed by a police officer, and whenever the rioting stopped, it started all over again. So this was a pretty dangerous time to be walking through the streets, because you didn't know if you would be a target or if you would be in a store and that store would get looted while you were shopping. So that's what happened in 2020. Okay, so now the timeline is around August 28th to be exact, and everybody's just minding their business, and they get this Twitter notification that Chadwick Boseman had died. He played in several films, but the film he was most known for was the Marvel film The Black Panther, and he died of pancreatic cancer. I believe he was either 42 or 43 years old. A lot of people around the world, not just the US, mourn his death because they saw him as a real life superhero. So for that, a lot of people took his death a little bit more personal than your typical celebrity death. Okay, so now we're around October when President Trump goes to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, who's the Israeli prime minister, and he convinces him to sign a peace treaty with those in the Middle East so that they can try to curate peace. So for many people, this was great news. For other people, they're very speculative of this news. But nonetheless, the peace treaty between Israel and the Middle East was signed in October 2020. Okay, let's talk about the Trump versus Biden election 2020. This was probably the most talked about presidential election in my lifetime. And I think this is probably going to be the most important election ever. Everything about this presidential election just screamed OMG. Before the election even happened, there was a lot of talk about possible voter fraud and if President Trump would concede after the election. So the day of the election, and this is all of my observation, I stayed up and watched the entire coverage of what was going on in terms of the numbers, the polls, the electoral college, the commentary, everything. And I believe it was around 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning when President Trump did his speech. Biden did his around 10 p.m. because people made fun of him for having to go to bed early. And I remember we made fun of Vice President Pence and how tired he looked trying to stay up so late so that they can present this speech. And this is not being biased because I don't really have an allegiance to either party. But what I will tell you is that statistically, there's just no way Biden could win. And after Trump's speech, it was around that time when word came out that they were going to stop counting the ballots until the next day. So we fall asleep, wake up, and then they say that Biden had won. And I was just like, how did he win these states by a landslide? Because Trump was winning by thousands. That became a huge controversy. Trump started to call voter fraud. The Democratic side started asking him to concede so that Biden can be up next to be the president. Although the media declared Biden as the winner for the 2020 presidential election, January 20th, we'll see who's the next president. But currently they are saying that Biden is going to be the future president of the United States of America. Last but not least, I want to talk about the vaccine that came out for the coronavirus in late November by Pfizer and Moderna. Now the thing is, these vaccines are very controversial because they came out in less than a year. And I used to teach students pharmacy tech, and I can tell you that is way too short of a time. Most drugs have to go through a process between 5 to 7 years in order to get approved. Most vaccines take about 10 years. So for this to happen in less than 12 months, a lot of people are just really skeptical about taking the vaccine. According to the CDC, only 1% of people have died, and it's actually less than 1% of people have actually died from the virus who did not have an underlying condition. So they are showing that the people who have died with COVID did have an underlying condition if they were not in that at-risk category. So that was just all that I experienced in 2020, and there was a lot of other things. In fact, personally, I actually had a really good year, but when it came to the news and what happened nationally and internationally, I would say that this was probably the toughest year for most people. A lot of people lost their jobs, kids had to stay home from school, the economy was shut down, divorces went up, suicide rates went up, and depression went up. So this was a pretty rough year, I think, for the majority of the people. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. Let let me know your thoughts. How was 2020 for you? And if you listen to this podcast episode way beyond this year, let me know what is going on in the year that you are listening so we can see if things got better, stayed the same, or got worse. So until next time, I will talk to you later. Happy New Year!